The clock is ticking. The U.S. government has until midnight, December 31st, to address its so-called fiscal cliff, the nickname given to a $500 billion time bomb of spending cuts and tax increases that will automatically kick in, potentially sending the economy into another tailspin. Joining us now to tell us what it all means, Don Coxe. He's strategy advisor with BMO Financial Group, and we're delighted to have you up here in the studio. Normally we've got you on the line from Chicago, so it's good to see you here. I gave a bit of a definition of what the fiscal cliff is there in that introduction, but do you want to put a little more meat on that bone?
Well, what it is a sign of the total breakdown of their governmental system, their ability to deal with budgets. Because the rule is that all tax policy must originate in the House of Representatives. The president is supposed to send a budget which goes to the Senate and the House. Obama issued no budgets for 3 years at all, and then sent one which was voted down 79 to nothing in the Senate.
He got no votes even from his own party on that.
Yeah. So there had been no budget process in a real sense. So in a desperation, they came up with a scheme whereby if they couldn't reach agreement by this date, that they would sequester $1.5 trillion of expenditures. Half which is going to be taken out of defense, and the rest was domestic programs. The idea was the Republicans would be too horrified at the defense cuts, and the Democrats would be too upset by cuts to social programs, so therefore they would reach an agreement. That was what they came up with.
So it's sort of like a doomsday machine.
That's right. And so you can think of it actually as that it's sort of like Cinderella's ball. We're coming up to midnight, but the bad sisters can't fit into the shoes. All right? And there may be a good sister out there, but we haven't found her yet. And therefore, everybody's going to turn into a pumpkin at midnight.
Well, let's continue the metaphor. How hard are they looking for this one sister in whose foot, or on whose foot that slipper will fit?
Well, Obama has decided he is it. He has decided that he has a mandate from the election. And so what he's proposed to them is something that is, as Speaker Boehner says, an insult. It includes an increase in stimulus spending at a time when the Republicans were overwhelmingly elected in the House, and of the majority in the House, overwhelmingly they were elected by a bigger margin in their district than Obama got nationally. So they're saying, under the Constitution, we have budget responsibilities. We were elected by people who told us to cut spending.
Which is true.
Yeah, and so there's where we're at. Canadians should rejoice in the parliamentary government system because at least you know how the decision-making goes, and if you've got a majority in Parliament, you can do something. You may not always be wise, but it does get done.
Well, let's understand, they call it a fiscal cliff presumably because if you go over it, everybody's dead. But that's not necessarily the case. So what happens after the 31st of December if, in fact, there is no agreement?
Well, then what happens is first of all, a whole bunch of stimulus things, including tax cuts, expire. So everybody's taxes will go up. Everybody except the 47% who pay no income tax. And then in addition, various programs get cut, as we say, because of sequestration. And we don't really know how all that unfolds because even if they do reach a temporary agreement, a stopgap, by Valentine's Day, we could face the new thing, which would be a Valentine's Day massacre, because they have to vote on an increase in the debt ceiling, which is another peculiarity of the American system, which is that all the federal debt that's outstanding, you have to vote to increase it to a new level, to make it legal. So in theory, we could get through this with some sort of thing, but if we didn't get a new debt ceiling increase, the U.S. would default on its debt. So all this is to happen by the middle of February. It should be an interesting time.
Having said that, I do hear rumblings that they could decide to, I guess, quote unquote, kick the can down the road, just give themselves a little more breathing time. Is that an option?
This is now a locution that dominates discussion. And any time you get something like that as a metaphor, what it means is a substitute for thought. So the U.S. is really in a much worse fiscal situation than people realize. If they did their counting the way we do for Canada Pension Plan in Canada, I'm a Canadian still, then they would see that the debt outstanding in the U.S. is 100% of GDP, which is roughly that of Italy. But they only count the debt that's held by the public, which means the debt that's held in the Social Security Trust Fund, the Military Trust Fund, the Highways Trust, doesn't count. And therefore they say we've got all this room. They don't.
So if you included all of the outstanding debt,
Yeah.
it's off the charts.
And they're proposing, you see, Obama has added more than $1 trillion in debt each year. He's increased the national debt by 60% in 4 years in office. That's some kind of record breaking. And he's proposing to do it again. And the Republicans are saying, we were elected to stop that. And he's saying, I have a bigger mandate than you have because your popularity as a go to the polls is 23% and I got a 53% vote. Let's fight. Remember, he's from the south side of Chicago, which is a take no prisoners philosophy.
We do remember. One of the fears, I guess, is that if they can't come to an agreement by New Year's Eve and these automatic kick-ins kick in, it's going to send the economy into another economic tailspin, maybe another recession. Do you have a view on that?
I believe, and I was sitting next to one of the best economists in the world by coincidence, Robert Gordon of Northwestern, an outstanding economist, one of the 5 who actually certifies for recessions in the United States. Very distinguished economist. And this debate came up in a small group. He said, absolutely, it's a 100% certainty, okay? So I'm not going to argue with him.
That the U.S. would go into recession again?
Yes.
Huh. So you're buying that too, then?
Well, I'm not going to argue with an economist. I mean, he's one of the few who's so well respected, and he's not known for being a loyalist of either side.
So if that were to be the case, a recession technically, meaning back-to-back quarters of negative growth, it's 6 months before you know it, though, right?
Yeah. And
but then you can take it to the bank after that.
If there's a functioning bank.
Yeah. Okay.
Because another problem the banking system, the U.S. has, of course, is the problem of the banking system, which once again Canada does not have.
How would, if all of this goes down in the negative, adverse way that we've just described, what kind of impact does that have on Canada?
Very serious. Roughly 37% of Canada's GDP is trade with the U.S. And so not only does it affect the trade you think of, you know, cars and all that, it's certainly going to affect things like the Stratford Festival, the Shaw Festival, Canadian vacation properties and so forth, because Americans will have less money to come in. And the other thing is the Canadian dollar will strengthen against the US dollar because the currency of a country which manages itself well is worth more than the country that mismanages its currency. No good deed goes unpunished in the currency markets. Now that Canadian dollar is included legally in foreign exchange reserves as against the yen, the pound, or the US dollar, there would be a big climb into the Canadian dollar, driving it up higher, so that the effects on the Canadian economy could be quite severe.
So revenues go down, deficits go up, north of the 49th, it all looks worse and worse.
Yeah, and Canada had no growth last month anyway, part because what's happening here, you see, is we're getting also into a state of stasis. Businesses are sitting on cash and not investing it because they're saying, we have no precedent for a breakdown like this. We know they've done dumb things in Washington, but this sudden Cinderella event is they say, we will get killed by our stockholders if we made major new commitments not knowing how this plays out.
Right. I want to ask you about the signs of compromise that may be in the air. And one of the few I've seen so far is the willingness by a few Republicans to, quote unquote, recant on the pledge they made to Grover Norquist, who heads that special interest group, saying no tax increases, not now, not ever. Some of them have said, we made that commitment X number of years ago, but you can't hold me to it for the rest of my life. And if the Democrats are prepared to move on Social Security and Medicare, we'll move on tax increases. Do you see more of that in the air down there?
The Democrats have made it clear that they're prepared to ease up on spending, but not on Social Security or Medicare. That they're off the table. They said that will be discussed and studied sometime next year. And as a matter of fact, Harry Reid, the head of the Senate, has said Social Security is right off the table. It doesn't contribute to the deficit, which is, of course, ridiculous. But so the question is, who is going to blink first? The oddity is that some very smart Republicans, including Bill Kristol of the Evening Standard, has pointed out that if they agree to Obama's proposal as it is on the table right now, there'd be a tax cut for 98% of Americans, because the Bush tax cuts would continue for 98% of the population. So they could say, why don't we just declare victory?
Well, and yet the Republicans are holding out for the 2% of the richest people in America.
And
does that make sense to you?
That's the part now that there's a review of that. partly as a result of Mitt Romney's inelegant locutions on the subject. And the Republicans do not want to be identified as the party of the rich. It's a fact that the highest level of Democrat support in the United States comes from the exact bottom of the income tax scale and the exact top of the richest people are Democratic liberals as a group.
And if
so
you raise their taxes,
why go to work for them?
Yeah, and if you raise their taxes, they're probably not going to be furious at you anyway.
They wouldn't notice it. I mean, they spill more than that in a day.
I've also heard it said that Obama is prepared to let this thing run out and go over the fiscal cliff because polls show that Republicans would tend to get blamed for that more than Democrats, and that, of course, would be a political advantage to him. Does that make sense to you?
I believe if that's the scariest part of it, that the people around and the Valerie Jarretts have done a calculation and said the polls show that if this happens, the Republicans will get the blame because Obama has an automatic access through the media, which I would argue that one of the reasons Obama gets along well with Russia is that the only G8 country which has a mainstream media as slavish as Obama's is Russia's. And so the mainstream media would help in getting the idea across this was 100% the Republicans' fault. And you're talking about individual congressmen trying to appear before cameras. Come on. On Obama, that's the one thing he does brilliantly is speak.
When some people, we put out a daily e-blast to let people know what's coming up, and when they saw that you were coming on, somebody from Mississauga said, ask him this. So here we go. This is from an email from a viewer. He writes, I think that the problem with the economy is permanent and will get worse. I see nothing but a downhill slide, and I don't see how implementing a deal to avoid the fiscal cliff in the USA will solve the problem. It will just be a more orderly plan of austerity that will cut GDP and bring on a recession. What to do? I think that our current debt-based system of economic growth needs a new mechanism, not only to move the economy forward, but to do it in ways that decrease income gaps, move us rapidly along a path toward environmental sanity, and decrease debt-to-GDP ratios. What do you think of what he's recommending here?
I just recommend that we also teach everybody to sing 10 leading American patriotic songs, because then we'd have a perfect answer. No, I'm for it. You can't try to put all these different agenda items together into one thing. This is a question of spending money or not spending money. It's a question of whether you show that the U.S. is able to solve its financial problems first and then argue about how you spend the money, which is different. It's also a question as to whether the United States will, as a result of this, be seen to become a second-rate power on the order of the nations within the Eurozone. Because what brought them down was not just the fact that they screwed up on things, but a perception that they were unable to get together to solve a problem even when they recognized it. So to have that cross the Atlantic, any solution that got through this for the next couple of years is better than no solution, because that funny little thing called faith, which animates all sorts of individual decisions, business decisions, and capital allocations. The U.S. has benefited because it spends 20% of its budgets on defense. The rest of the world is glad, even though they can criticize them, that somebody's out there doing that. And therefore, if the defense budget gets slashed, so the defense secretary said this would be murderous to the Department of Defense. China is not going to cut back on its increase in defense spending and its aggressive tactics if the U.S. is unilaterally disarming.
Okay, we got 2 minutes to go here, and I'm taking notes. Get us back from the fiscal cliff. What's in that formula?
Okay, what you do is you get agreement on the continuing the Bush tax cuts. You get an agreement to set an exact target for how much you're going to, by the end of next year, control cost expansions of Medicare and Social Security, and you put a target on those two things. It's important to narrow down what you're controlling, because if you do that, you've dealt with 40% of the budget.
Okay. Anything else?
And if you can manage those two things, what you can say, prepare for prosperity, because what you're going to start having then is a big change in the economy and people's attitudes. And then you're going to have to say, okay, maybe we can't quite think about all the other things we'd like to do. We're going to have to probably deal with inflation. but it'll be a pleasure.
I don't see anything here about moving the income tax rates on the high end to 39%.
What you do is you include that in it because what you do is you simply say on that you raise it to that, but you put a limit of $50,000 on what the high-end people can deduct for all sorts of things like mortgage. Would you believe that a huge percentage of all mortgage interest deductions are people with McMansion homes? Why should they have that? The Republicans conceded that in advance. If you take away that mortgage interest deduction, thankfully Canada doesn't have it, if you took that away at the same time, you would get huge amounts of revenue in, and we got to stand up and cheer.
I'm making you Treasury Secretary for the next 30 seconds. Go do it.
Thank you.
Donald Coxe, good of you to be with us here at TVO
Pleasure.
today. Thanks so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.